I was cut out of the will because I'm not family, but now that I've inherited $3 million, they suddenly want me. My name is Emily, and when I was 14, my life changed in a way I never expected. I remember the day my mom, Sarah, sat me down and told me she was remarrying. It wasn't like I hadn't seen it coming. She and James had been dating for a while, but the finality of it hit me hard. James seemed decent enough at first, always polite and friendly when he came over. But then came the kicker. I wasn't just getting a new stepdad. I was getting a stepbrother too, a guy named Cameron who was 3 years older than me. I'll admit, at first I thought maybe it would be kind of cool to have an older brother. I'd never had siblings before, so part of me hoped it might be like what you see in those cheesy family sitcoms, where we'd bond over dumb things and eventually become close. But reality hit fast. From the moment we moved in together, it was clear Cameron wasn't thrilled about the idea of sharing his dad or his space with me. The first night in the new house, I remember walking past his room, hearing him talking to a friend on the phone. Yeah, my dad's new wife brought her kid. It's whatever, I guess, he said, like I was just some annoying add-on. That's when it really sank in. Cameron didn't see me as family. He barely saw me as anything. That feeling of being an outsider, like I didn't belong in my own home, grew stronger every day after that. He didn't go out of his way to be mean, but it was the little things that chipped away at me. The way he'd barely look up when I walked into a room, the way he'd ignore me when I tried to talk, or how he'd give this annoyed sigh whenever my mom asked him to include me in something, like I was a chore he had to deal with. At first, I tried not to let it bother me. I figured maybe it was just awkward for him, adjusting to a new family. But the cold shoulder never really went away. Things got a lot worse when my mom and James had Liam, my baby stepbrother. It was like the entire house shifted overnight. Suddenly, everything revolved around him, their perfect little family. My room, the one place that still felt like mine, was converted into a nursery for Liam. I got moved into this cramped little guest room that barely had enough space for my bed and a small dresser. I remember trying to fit my books and stuff into the room, but there just wasn't enough space. I ended up shoving most of my things into boxes in the garage. It wasn't just the room, though. It was like with Liam's arrival. I became invisible. All the attention went to him, and the little bit of care or concern I still got from my mom was gone. She was so focused on the baby, on James, on making everything perfect for this new phase of their lives, that I was left on the sidelines, feeling more like a guest than a daughter. Cameron, on the other hand, made himself right at home. He treated the place like it was his personal playground. He'd come into my room, well, Liam's room, whenever he wanted, rifling through my stuff without even asking. One time, I came home from school and found him wearing my headphones, sprawled out on my bed, scrolling through my sketchbook like it was his. When I asked him to give it back, he just shrugged and said, "Relax, it's not a big deal." And the worst part? When I told my mom, she acted like I was overreacting. "He's just trying to bond with you," she said, brushing me off like it was nothing. It was always like that. Cameron could do no wrong, but if I so much as raised my voice or slammed a door in frustration, I'd get lectured about being disrespectful. I was starting to feel like I didn't matter at all. The house that was supposed to be my home felt more like a place I just existed in, and I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to set anyone off. So I started spending less time there. I threw myself into school, joined every club I could, signed up for after-school activities, anything to avoid being home. The later I could stay out, the better. School became my escape, the one place where I could breathe without feeling like I was intruding on someone else's life. It wasn't like I was rebelling or anything. I wasn't skipping classes or sneaking out to parties. I was just trying to survive in a place that didn't feel like mine anymore. After Liam was born, things in the house got even worse. It wasn't just the physical space I lost when they turned my room into his nursery. It felt like I'd lost my place in the family entirely. Mom and James were completely wrapped up in being new parents. I get it, babies need a lot of attention, but it felt like I had disappeared. All their energy went into Liam, whether it was his crying, his feeding, his naps, and I became an afterthought. I was always tiptoeing around them, trying not to be a bother. The worst part was how much everyone seemed to adore Liam. I'd overhear Mom and James talking about how perfect he was, how cute, how lucky they were to have him. I don't think I ever heard them talk about me like that. Not once. I tried to be happy for them, to feel something other than bitterness, but the more I tried, the more it felt like I was being pushed out of the picture. Cameron, though, he seemed to be thriving in all of this. He was always there, helping out with Liam, carrying him around, playing the perfect big brother. It was like he'd slipped right into this new role in the family that I could never fit into. And the more he settled in, the less room there was for me. That guest room I was crammed into was barely big enough to fit my stuff. My bed, the old one from my real room, took up most of the space. The dresser, which was too small to hold all my clothes, sat awkwardly in the corner. I tried to make it my own, hanging a few posters and putting up some photos, but it never felt right. The walls were this dull, beige color, and the only window faced the side of the house, offering a view of the neighbor's fence. It was nothing like the room I had before, my room where I could spread out, where I had my own little world. Now, it felt like I was living out of a suitcase. Cameron didn't make things any easier. He treated the house like it was his domain, including whatever tiny space I had left. He'd barge into my room without knocking, help himself to whatever he wanted, my books, my laptop, my headphones. Once, he even took my favorite hoodie and didn't return it for weeks. When I asked him where it was, he shrugged and said he thought it was community property. I couldn't believe it. What was worse, when I confronted him about it, I was the one who got in trouble. "Why are you always so uptight?" Mom would say, as if I was the one causing the problems. It was like I was invisible until I did something wrong. It became this constant cycle. Cameron would mess with my stuff or take something without asking, and when I tried to stand up for myself, I was the one getting scolded for not being more understanding. I wasn't even sure what I was supposed to be understanding about anymore. That he could do whatever he wanted because he was the golden child? That I should just accept being shoved aside because there was a new baby in the house? It felt like nothing I did mattered, like I couldn't win no matter how hard I tried. And the worst part was I could see how much everyone else doted on Cameron, like he was this perfect son. James treated him like his little shadow, always praising him for being so responsible and helpful with Liam. Even my mom, would look at him with this proud smile, like he was her own. I knew they wanted me to be like him, to act like I was part of this new, happy family they were building, but it was impossible. I couldn't just pretend I wasn't angry, hurt, and completely out of place. So I pulled away even more. I stayed late at school almost every day. I joined every club I could, drama, debate, student council, anything that would keep me out of the house. I'd even hang around after class, pretending to work on homework, just so I didn't have to go home and face the suffocating tension there. Home didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place where I was constantly in the way, constantly screwing up just by existing. I started spending more and more time at friends' houses too, crashing on their couches after school or on weekends. I knew my mom noticed. I'd catch her glancing at me sometimes when I was leaving, but she never said anything. Maybe she was too tired from dealing with Liam, or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, I stopped expecting her to ask. School became my refuge. The halls, the classrooms, the chaos of lunchtime, all of it was better than being at home. I could breathe there. I could just be Emily, not the girl who didn't fit in her own family. I stayed busy on purpose, signing up for every extra class or activity just to have an excuse to stay out longer. It wasn't even about having fun. It was about survival. About keeping myself from getting swallowed up by the emptiness I felt every time I walked through the front door. By the time I turned 18, I was hanging on by a thread. The house had turned into a place I actively avoided. I was so used to being pushed aside, ignored, or blamed that I hardly spoke to anyone anymore. If I wasn't at school or a friend's house, I was locked away in my tiny guest room, headphones in, doing my best to drown out the noise of life going on without me. But things reached a boiling point the night Cameron decided to throw a party while our parents were away. I still remember walking into the house after staying late at a friend's, hoping to sneak into my room unnoticed and just collapse in a bed. Instead, I opened the door to chaos. The whole place was packed with people. Loud music, red Solo cups everywhere, and the smell of alcohol hitting me the second I stepped inside. I barely recognized my own house. It was like some stranger had taken over the place, and I was just an intruder. I pushed through the crowd, making my way down the hall. hoping to escape the noise. But when I reached my room, my little space of peace in this mess, I stopped cold. My door was wide open. The lamp on my desk was knocked over. My school books were scattered across the floor, and there were beer stains soaking through the pages of my homework. Torn pieces of paper, stuff I'd been working on for weeks, were everywhere, trampled under muddy footprints. I stood there, frozen, as the anger built up inside me. This wasn't just a mess. This was my last bit of space being violated. The one place where I still had some control, some sense of ownership, was trashed like it didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. I stormed out of the room, adrenaline pumping, and went straight to find Cameron. It wasn't hard. He was in the living room, laughing with a group of his friends, acting like the king of the house. I could feel my fists clenching, my face burning with frustration as I marched up to him. "What the hell, Cameron?" I shouted over the music. He looked at me with this lazy, half-drunk grin, like he didn't have a care in the world. "What's your problem?" he said, barely even looking up from his drink. I could see his friends snickering, whispering to each other, and it only fueled my rage. "My room," I snapped. "You trashed my room?" He shrugged, taking another sip of his drink like it was nothing. "Chill out, Emily. It's just a party." "Just a party?" I repeated, incredulous. I could feel my voice shaking, but I didn't care anymore. "You ruined my stuff, Cameron. My schoolwork, everything. What is wrong with you?" His friends were all watching now, some of them laughing under their breath. He didn't even look fazed. "You shouldn't leave your door open then," he said casually, his tone dripping with indifference. "It's not my fault if people wandered in." That was it. The final straw. All the years of feeling invisible, of being treated like I didn't belong in my own home, came crashing down in that moment. I was done being polite, done holding back. I turned on my heel, ignoring the snickers behind me, and marched upstairs. If no one else was going to stand up for me, I was going to stand up for myself. When Mom and James came home the next day, I was ready. I explained everything. The party, the damage, how Cameron had let his friends trash my room like it didn't even matter. I thought, surely this time they'd back me up. This time they'd see what I was going through and finally take my side. But instead, James gave me this tired, disappointed look like I was the one in the wrong. "Emily, you should have been more responsible," he said, his voice calm but condescending. "You know how Cameron's friends can be. You should have locked your door." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stared at him, waiting for my mom to step in, to say something, to defend me. But she just stood there, holding Liam, looking like she didn't want to get involved. That look, that's what really broke me. I realized right then that nothing I said, nothing I did, would ever change how they saw me. I wasn't part of this family. I was just an afterthought, a burden they had to tolerate. That's when I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep living in a house where I didn't matter, where I was always the one at fault. I had been holding on, trying to make it work, but now I was done. After that day, something shifted inside me. I felt numb. There wasn't even anger left anymore, just this cold, hollow acceptance that nothing was going to change. I'd spent years waiting for things to get better, hoping maybe one day my mom would see how miserable I was, or that Cameron would stop treating me like I didn't exist. But that moment, with James blaming me for Cameron's mess, made it crystal clear. I was never going to be a part of this family. I barely spoke to anyone after that. I avoided James entirely, and with Mom, I kept things short. She must have noticed, but like always, she didn't say anything. She was too wrapped up in Liam and trying to keep the peace with James to deal with me. I didn't bother confronting Cameron either. What was the point? He had everything he wanted. My room, my stuff, my mom's approval. I was just a shadow in that house, and that's how they liked it. So I started planning my way out. College had always been something I looked forward to, not just for the education, but as an escape. I needed to get out of that house, out of that suffocating environment where I was always the outsider. I had been saving up every dollar I could from my part-time job at the local bookstore. It wasn't much, but I knew it was enough to get me started somewhere else. I didn't care where, as long as it wasn't here. I found a small apartment near the college I was planning to attend. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place, old and a little run-down, but it was mine. I could already picture myself there, free from the constant tension, free from Cameron and James and all the baggage that came with them. I wasn't exactly excited about the move. I was too drained to feel excited, but it gave me a sense of relief. Like, for the first time in years, I had some control over my life. I didn't tell anyone about my plans at first. I kept it to myself, working out the details in secret, making sure everything was lined up. Every time I walked past Cameron's door, every time I saw James watching TV in the living room like nothing was wrong, I felt this little spark of satisfaction inside me. Soon, I'm out of here. Soon, none of this will matter. It was like a countdown ticking away in my mind. But, of course, the universe has a funny way of throwing curveballs at you just when you think you've got things figured out. I was sitting on my bed one night, scrolling through my phone, mentally going over my escape plan, when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. "Hello, Emily?" The voice on the other end was formal, unfamiliar. "This is Howard Klein. I'm an attorney for your grandmother, Mary." I sat up straight, heart racing. I hadn't seen or heard from my grandmother in years. She lived on the other side of the country, and my mom never really talked about her. I vaguely remembered visiting her a couple of times when I was younger, but we weren't close. I barely knew her. "I'm sorry to inform you, but your grandmother passed away a few weeks ago," the lawyer continued. "She left a substantial inheritance to you. I'd like to discuss the details if you have a moment." I blinked, stunned. "Inheritance? From my grandmother?" I repeated, like I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. "Yes," he confirmed. It's a sizable amount. She left you $3 million. For a second, I thought maybe this was some kind of prank like one of those scams you hear about. But as the lawyer explained the details, it became clear. It was real. $3 million. From a woman I barely knew. I hung up the phone in a daze. I couldn't even wrap my head around it. $3 million. What was I supposed to do with that kind of money? And why me? Why would my grandmother leave me all that when she barely had any relationship with me? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. But the answer didn't really matter. What mattered was that, suddenly, everything had changed. I wasn't just escaping. I was walking out of that house with the kind of financial freedom I had never even dreamed of. But it didn't take long for the news to reach my family. And that's when everything truly went to hell. I didn't plan on telling anyone about the inheritance right away. I needed time to process it myself, to figure out what I was going to do with this insane amount of money that had just dropped into my life out of nowhere. But, as with everything else in that house, secrets didn't stay secret for long. I don't know how, but within days my mom and James found out. Maybe it was a letter that came in the mail, maybe someone from the lawyer's office let it slip. Either way, they knew. The first sign that something was up came when my mom suddenly started acting nice. Not just her usual, distracted kind of nice, but overly nice, like she was trying too hard. It was weird. She started asking me about school, about my plans, things she hadn't cared about in years. She even offered to help me pack for college, something she hadn't even mentioned before. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off, but I pushed it aside, thinking maybe she was just trying to make up for lost time. Then James started being extra friendly too, which was a huge red flag. He'd never paid much attention to me unless it was to criticize something I'd done wrong. But now he was all smiles. He'd pat me on the back when he saw me, ask me how things were going with school, if I needed help with anything. It made my skin crawl. I knew something was up. It wasn't until one evening, when we were all sitting down for dinner, that the truth finally came out. "So," James started casually, spearing a piece of chicken with his fork, "I heard about your grandmother." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. I hadn't mentioned anything to them about the inheritance. How the hell did they know? Mom chimed in next, trying to sound nonchalant, but failing miserably. "Yeah, honey, I know it must have been a shocker passing. We hadn't seen her in a long time." I could feel the tension building in the room, like we were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. I put my fork down, staring at both of them, waiting for them to get to the point. James leaned back in his chair, giving me this smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I also heard she left you a pretty nice inheritance." And there it was, the real reason behind all the sudden kindness. I should have known. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She did." The room went quiet for a moment, and I could see the gears turning in their heads. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly where this conversation was going. James cleared his throat. You know, Emily, that kind of money could really help the family out. I mean, we've been struggling a bit, what with Liam and all the bills. It's been hard making ends meet. I just stared at him. Struggling? They were struggling? I was the one who'd been shoved into a tiny room and practically ignored for years. But now, suddenly, they needed my help? Mom leaned forward, her voice soft, almost pleading. Emily, you know we've always done our best to take care of you. I know things haven't been perfect, but we're a family. And families help each other. I could feel the anger rising in me, but I kept my face neutral. What exactly are you asking me for? I said, even though I already knew the answer. James didn't even hesitate. Well, we were thinking maybe you could contribute some of that money to the family. Help us out with the mortgage. Maybe set something aside for Liam's future. Liam. Of course, it always came back to Liam, the favorite, the golden child who had everything handed to him while I was left to fend for myself. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. So, you think I should just give you the money? Is that it? Mom jumped in, her voice all soft and sweet. Not all of it, honey. Just a portion. You'll still have plenty for yourself. But this could really make things easier for us. For the whole family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd put me through, after years of being treated like I didn't matter, they had the nerve to sit there and ask me for my money. Money that I hadn't even had the chance to fully process myself yet. Money that, for the first time in my life, gave me the chance to finally be free of them. I shook my head slowly. No, I said quietly. James blinked, as if he hadn't expected me to say that. Excuse me? I said no. I repeated, my voice louder now. I'm not giving you any of it. The room went dead silent. Mom's face hardened, the sweetness in her voice disappearing instantly. Emily, she said, her tone sharp now, you're being selfish. This money could help the family. It's the right thing to do. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I've done enough for this family, I snapped. I'm not giving you a dime. James stood up too, his face red with anger. You ungrateful little. That's enough. I cut him off, my voice shaking with fury. You think you can just use me when it's convenient for you? You've treated me like I didn't matter for years. And now you want me to bail you out? No. I'm done. I turned and walked out of the room before either of them could say another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my mom calling after me, her voice rising, but I didn't stop. I went straight to my room, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. They didn't care about me. They never had. All they cared about was the money. I'd seen it in their eyes, the way their voices changed the moment they thought they could get their hands on it. They were my family. They were leeches trying to suck me dry. But not this time. I wasn't going to let them take anything from me. Not anymore. The first call came late one evening, just as I was starting to feel comfortable in my new place. I was sitting on the couch, the TV on, but barely paying attention, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen and saw my mom's name flash across it. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Part of me didn't want to pick up at all. I wasn't ready to deal with her yet, not after everything that had happened. But a tiny voice in the back of my head told me to hear her out. Maybe, just maybe, she was calling to apologize, to try and make things right. I answered. Emily, my mom's voice crackled through the speaker, no warmth in her tone. We need to talk. I could feel the tension creeping back into my body instantly. About what? I asked, already knowing the answer. The money, she said bluntly, like we hadn't already had this conversation 100 times. You can't just keep it all to yourself. That money should go to the family. It's only fair. I clenched my jaw, the familiar anger rising up in me. We've been over this, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The money was left to me. I'm not giving it to you, and I'm definitely not giving it to James. There was a pause on the other end, and then my mom's voice turned sharp. You're being selfish, Emily. That money wasn't meant just for you. Your grandmother didn't understand how things were between us, how much we've struggled. You need to help us? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. Struggle? You've treated me like an outsider for years. I was never part of your family. Not really. So don't start talking to me about fairness now. Don't be dramatic, she snapped. We're family, whether you like it or not. And family helps each other. I could feel my patience wearing thin. Family helps each other? I repeated. Like how you helped me by letting Cameron walk all over me. Like how you shoved me into a closet of a room and barely spoke to me unless I did something wrong. That kind of help? There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought maybe she had finally run out of things to say. But when she spoke again, her voice was colder than ever. If you don't help us, Emily, you'll regret it. You can't just abandon your family. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. I didn't abandon you. You pushed me away. And now, you only want me around because of the money. That's not family. That's greed. With that, I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. I threw the phone down on the couch, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and frustration. I knew I'd made the right decision to leave, but that didn't make it any easier. The calls didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I'd get them almost every other day. First it was my mom, then James. He wasn't even trying to hide his anger anymore, accusing me of being ungrateful, of turning my back on them after everything they'd done for me, as if they had ever really done anything but make my life miserable. One night, after yet another call from James, I got so frustrated that I turned off my phone and threw it across the room, letting it land on the bed. I didn't want to deal with them anymore. I had left that house to escape the constant pressure, the guilt, the feeling of never being good enough. But somehow, even from a distance, they were still trying to control me. It was like no matter how far I ran, they would always find a way to pull me back in. The worst part wasn't even the calls. It was the fact that in some twisted way, they made me doubt myself. Every time my mom's voice echoed in my head, "You're being selfish, Emily. You'll regret this." I'd feel that familiar knot of guilt tighten in my stomach. Even after everything they put me through, a part of me still wondered if I was wrong for leaving, if I should have given in and just handed over the money to make things easier. But then I'd remember all the years I spent being treated like I didn't matter. All the times I was overlooked, ignored, or blamed for things that weren't my fault. I'd remember the night Cameron trashed my room and how my mom and James had sided with him, like my feelings didn't even register on their radar. No, I wasn't the selfish one. Not this time. Still, it was exhausting, feeling like I had to constantly defend my decision to take control of my own life. I'd hoped that leaving that house would bring me peace, but all it did was bring more battles. I knew I needed to cut them off completely. Block their numbers, change my phone, something, but it was harder than I thought. Despite everything, they were still my family. And no matter how much they had hurt me, walking away from them for good wasn't as easy as I wanted it to be. The breaking point came one night when my mom showed up at my apartment. I hadn't told her where I lived, but I guess she had found out through some family friend or maybe even stalked me on social media. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, her face set in that familiar expression of disappointment, I felt my heart sink. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice tense. "We need to talk, Emily," she said, pushing past me into the apartment before I could even protest. My mom barging into my apartment was like a punch to the gut. I stood there for a second, stunned, watching her walk around like she had every right to be there. She didn't even wait for me to invite her in, just waltzed through the door like she owned the place. The sight of her in my new space, this little corner of the world I had carved out for myself, felt like an invasion. I closed the door, my hands shaking slightly as I turned to face her. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the small living room, the plain walls, the few pieces of furniture I'd managed to gather. "This is where you've been staying?" she asked, completely ignoring my question. "You call this a home?" I swallowed back the frustration rising in my throat. "Yes, it's mine." She shook her head, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Emily, you could do so much better than this. With all the money you have now, why are you living in a dump like this?" I clenched my fists, fighting to stay calm. "Because it's mine, and it's enough for me." She sighed dramatically, like I was being unreasonable, and sat down on the couch, crossing her legs like she was settling in for a long conversation. I didn't move. I wasn't about to sit down and act like this was some normal visit. I wanted her out. Now. What do you want, Mom? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. She looked up at me, her eyes cold and calculating. I want you to stop being so stubborn and think about what you're doing to this family. You've completely shut us out. You've refused to help, and all we've done is try to support you. I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. Support me? Support me? You've never supported me. Not once. All you and James have done is make me feel like I don't belong. And now, suddenly, because I have money, you're here? You think I don't see through that? Her face hardened. You don't understand, Emily. James and I. James and you. I cut her off, my anger finally spilling over. I don't care about James. I don't care about his problems, or his bills, or his mortgage. He's not my dad. He's just the guy you married, and I'm done pretending like I owe him anything. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger bubbling up in her. You're being ridiculous. This is about more than just you. It's about all of us. You're part of this family, whether you like it or not. I felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on me, but I shoved it aside. Not this time. I wasn't going to let her twist things around anymore. I'm not part of anything, I said, my voice cold. Not the way you think. I'm not a backup plan for when things get tough. I'm not the person you turn to only when you need something. I'm not your safety net. Her face flushed red with anger, and for a second, I thought she might yell. But instead, she stood up, taking a slow step toward me. You're making a huge mistake, Emily. One day, you're going to need us, and when that day comes, don't expect us to be there. I stared at her, the words stinging more than I wanted to admit. You were never there, I said quietly. She froze just for a moment, and I saw something flash across her face. Regret, maybe. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by the hard, defensive expression she always wore when she wasn't getting her way. Fine, she said, her voice tight. Do what you want. But don't think for a second that you'll be welcomed back with open arms after you've abandoned your family. I felt a bitter laugh escape my throat. You already abandoned me a long time ago, Mom. She didn't reply. She just stared at me for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind her. I stood there for a few minutes, the silence of the apartment ringing in my ears. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the heat of the confrontation still coursing through my veins. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I had stood my ground. I hadn't let her guilt me or manipulate me into giving in. I had fought back, and now maybe, just maybe, I could finally move on. But it didn't take long for the real consequences to hit. The next day, the phone call stopped. The silence should have felt like relief, but instead, it weighed on me in a different way. It was like I had cut the last thread connecting me to my family, and even though I knew it was the right thing to do, it still hurt. Then came the text messages. Not from my mom or James, but from other family members, people I hadn't heard from in years. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all suddenly had opinions about the situation, and of course, none of them were on my side. The knock on the door threw me off. I half expected it to be my mom again, but instead, it was Rachel, standing there with a scowl on her face. You blocked my number? She demanded, pushing past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. I sighed, already exhausted by the day's constant barrage of messages. Yeah, I did. I'm not interested in having this conversation, Rachel. She spun around, her arms crossed tightly. You're acting like a selfish brat. How could you do this to your mom? She's been nothing but good to you. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. You don't know anything about what it's been like for me. You haven't been around. Rachel scoffed. Family is family, Emily. You don't just cut people off because things get tough. I shook my head. It's not about things getting tough. It's about finally standing up for myself. I'm done being treated like I don't matter. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression softening slightly, but then she just shook her head. You're making a mistake. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my hands shaking. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. But I knew, deep down, I had made the right choice. After Rachel stormed out, the quiet in my apartment felt different. It wasn't as suffocating as before. Sure, I was still upset, but a part of me felt relieved, like I had finally drawn a line. The messages stopped after that. I didn't hear from anyone else in the family for a while. With the silence, I started focusing on myself. I threw myself into getting settled, decorating my apartment, working out a routine, and even looking into classes to keep my mind busy. Slowly, things started feeling normal, peaceful even. I reached out to my closest friends more. They had been my real support system through everything, not my family. They knew me for who I really was, not who they wanted me to be. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't completely over. My family wasn't the type to let things go that easily. I wasn't naive. I knew another confrontation was coming. But for now, I was going to enjoy the quiet and the control I finally had over my life.